All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome to the School of Wrestling podcast. Today on the episode, I'm super excited to introduce you to Heather Reid. She is the author of this book, uh, Introduction to the Philosophy of Sport. She's a professor of the philosophy of sport, and she has studied extensively the Greek culture and how the Greeks viewed sport and how it connects to the sport of wrestling in particular. I'm super excited about this podcast. We talked about a ton of stuff that I had been talking about previously, like arete and the virtue ethics, and how they used activity in sport as a way to cultivate virtue. Heather Reid is an expert in this area that I think is going to help the wrestling community and hopefully maybe even more people outside of the wrestling community kind of understand the role of philosophy and how it pertains to sport, to give us maybe a better understanding as to why we should participate in sport collectively as a society. So I hope you enjoy this episode, and thanks for watching.
Yeah, although I have to say that sport is older than philosophy.
Okay.
But you could say that there was a philosophy before sport that has to do with heroes and the mythology surrounding heroes. So there's a philosophy in that sense. But before people like Socrates and Plato and even show up and start inventing this thing called ethics, you have sport and it's being practiced in ancient Greece.
Okay. And so, so all of this stuff exists, but when I became interested in your work, I came across a piece that you had written called "Wrestling with Socrates," and it kind of connected me to this idea of combining the sport of wrestling to philosophy, which were at the moment two separate endeavors of mine. Right, I had obviously gone out and wrestled my whole life, and I came to philosophy through a interest in understanding the universe better, right? Because I did not connect with a religion or theology that made sense. So I was looking for answers in different places. So I found philosophy, and I specifically found Plato and Socrates. And in the process, had two separate things. And then when I came across your work, I kind of had the opportunity to merge them together and make so much more sense out of my experience with wrestling, and like with my existence in the world. So it was really cool to kind of see that there was actually a connection to wrestling long before I tried to make the connection. So your work kind of illuminated that. But I've been talking to people a lot about your book, The Philosophy of Sport. And what I wanted to do is kind of just introduce you and say, well, one, how did you get into studying the philosophy of sport, and kind of explain what it is.
Great. Well, I had been a practicing athlete like you, Dalton, since before, since high school and before I even started college. And in college, I studied both literature, especially English literature, and also philosophy. And I was also very, very active athlete. I was actually intercollegiate cycling champion in 1986. So I was really seriously working in athletics, and I was serious as a student and interested in philosophy. And at a certain point, I decided to go to graduate school in philosophy. And while I was there, I took a seminar on Plato, and I just seemed to be able to kind of understand what he was saying, or I seemed to have a kind of a facility with him that I noticed other people didn't have. So it's kind of like when you're an athlete, if you're pretty good at one particular sport or something, you have a kind of feel for it. And as time went on, I realized that, as I put it, Plato thinks like a jock. And then it turns out that he had been an athlete. And I started to think that maybe one of the reasons that I could kind of understand the way he was thinking is because through my experience in sport, I understood sport, or we both understood a common thing, this kind of what you might call an agonistic or a competitive way of looking at ethics and excellence and things like that play out in both philosophy and the practice of sport. So just by doing sport, and it doesn't matter what sport you do, I think that you through experience, you learn a kind of a philosophy. And then what happens is when you study philosophy, you'll get all the vocabulary and the words and the story and all that stuff that goes with it. But in a way, you already knew it because you were living it as an athlete. Yeah,
The
I don't
reason,
know. I mean, it depends because you can mean so many different things by different words. Like when you say philosophy, do you mean having a theory about, the universe, or even more specifically about who we are and how we ought to live? I think everybody, even as children, we develop these kinds of ideas, partly from our environment, partly from how we're taught, and hopefully from some independent thought and our own experiences about, how we want to live. And so we're already doing philosophy in that sense. But actually studying philosophy, especially in America, most people don't do it until college, if then. We don't have it at, in a lot of places, like here in Italy, you'll study philosophy in high school and even middle school sometimes,
yeah,
but not in America. And so I think that I don't think it matters which one you do first, but I do think that especially for ancient Greek philosophy and these ideas of virtue ethics, that it's really helpful to have been an athlete, and having been an athlete can help you to understand in a lot of ways the way they're thinking. Because, sport is in a way is like a miniature life, or it's a place in which we express our philosophies of life in kind of a miniature way, because we perform. And you could say you perform in life too, but you have to actually act out what you believe. And there's a kind of a truth. This is one of the things I say about the similarity between philosophy and sport. In sport too, you start with a question and a doubt and an uncertainty. And you try and clarify that. You try to improve that by asking questions and then answering them with your actions. You can't just make something up. I mean, that's what's really beautiful about sport. And so it teaches you this kind of truth back, because the performance is there and it's
yeah,
public, and you have to deal with it and other people too. Yeah, I
right.
don't think you could say, yeah, I think you're right about that. I don't think you'd say, I'm going to read, Plato's Republic, and then I'm going to go out and try to play my sport, as an expression of that. I don't think that would make sense. It would be a sensical way to do it. But I do think that it's good to understand your athletic experience and even your your expression of yourself through sport as an expression of your philosophy of life, as saying something about who you are and what you care about and things like that. And I do think, especially for young people who a lot of times experience sport as responding to commands that other people give them, that they do need to think about taking, some trying to express themselves through what they do too. I mean, you can't, obviously in sport we play by rules, people have coaches, you can't just make it up as you go along, like Calvin Ball, that comic strip Calvin and Hobbes, when Calvin would play this game called Calvin Ball, and Calvin would just declare the rules whenever he wanted. And of course it was impossible to have a sport because you didn't know what the criteria were. So you can't treat sport like that, but you can think about how the way you play sport expresses what you really believe and who you really are. And you can both shape those things through your performance. In other words, I can express who I am and who I want to be through sport, and I can sort of set goals in there that better express who I want to be.
Yeah,
For example, if you know that you have a hard time getting motivated, but once the competition starts, that you're really quick to be motivated, you can set goals for yourself, and you can do little things to improve so that you can try to take control of what motivates you and things like that. So it's kind of like, you can almost think of it as a little personal experiment area where you can try different aspects of your personality. I mean, I think a couple comments on that. One is to not think of it as information. I mean, just like the sentence you just read out is very complicated, and certainly children aren't going to understand it, and even a lot of adults aren't going to understand it. A lot of educated people won't understand it on the linguistic level, but in a way they understand it through their experience, and they don't necessarily wouldn't use those words or wouldn't explain it that way, but they've got an experience of it. So one way, instead of thinking of it as information that you're putting into somebody, think of it as like kind of a rough or a raw experience that they already have, that you're trying to help them to communicate and appreciate and sort of activate by having the words and being able to talk to them about it. And so it's like, think of it as something that's already there, and then you're sort of uncovering they used to say Michelangelo would look at this, this sort of shit piece of marble and see the statue in there, and then he would just remove everything that wasn't the statue. And that was, I mean, I don't even know if that's true, but the idea is that it's already there. And one thing I think with kids is, the other thing is just kind of trust sport. You're putting them in a sport, constructs a place where they can learn about themselves and they can be challenged. And so really you're just sort of constructing this mechanism that allows them just to learn about themselves. And they're not going to, at the end of the sport, come out with some formula like you just read. They're going to learn something just from that experience, even if it's not verbal or can't be expressed verbally. And so I don't know if you have to worry about sort of teaching them about philosophy. They're already doing philosophy just by being alive and living. And especially if they just think about that, about what their experience means for them. Well, really, arte is a word that expresses the excellence of any kind of thing at performing its function. So if you have a thing like a knife, its function is to, cut through, vegetables or whatever. So what do you want? You want something that's sharp. You want something that's balanced, doesn't rust, blah, blah, blah. So that's the concept. And then when you apply it to human being, you say, well, what is excellence in the human being? And how do we achieve it? Now, the way the Greeks thought about it is they imagined their gods as sort of perfected human beings. They had their gods, what we call anthropomorphic, the shape of human beings. And so in a lot of ways, gods, and then below gods, heroes who were actually mortal, but had certain perfections, not total perfections, then sort of inspired other human beings or mortals to try to be more like heroes and more like gods. And so really arte is this idea of excellence in human beings. And because there's so many different kinds of human beings and so many different roles and all that, there's a lot of different conceptions, like individual ideas of what arte is, but the general idea is this idea of excellence, which we also, I think you thought there were two kinds, because we also translate it as virtue, which can seem like a different thing than excellence. But it's not in the Greek context. Being excellent and being virtuous is pretty much the same thing. It has to do with the quality of the quality of a thing in its ability to do what it was made to do.
The Greeks believed that arte was the highest form of virtue, correct?
Well, short of being a god, yeah. Well, I mean, one thing is there are different virtues, like courage, for example, or self-control. The Greeks called it self-asune. And then there's and those are called aratai, plural. But there's the general idea is just the excellence, and then it's different depending on what it's applied to, whether it's a human being or something else. And for some people it's different if it's applied to a man or a woman or a child or an old person or whatever. The actual content of it can change, but the general idea is the same as excellence. And that's one of the good things about virtue ethics, is that instead of having a set of fixed rules, or like in any given situation saying that the right thing, the moral thing to do is this particular thing, they basically say, just be excellent, just be the best you can be. And then whatever the excellent person, whatever the virtuous person does in a given situation will be right. Okay, so soma is the word that the Greeks would use for our body. And then psyche is the word they would use for mind, but also soul. And so when you think of a soma, a body, you want to think of the material aspect of a human being, everything that's made of matter, right? Blood, water, skin, muscles, everything. When you think of a psyche, you want to think of what we might call the spiritual or the mental or the non-material part. The thing the part of you that thinks, the part of you that has emotions, the part of you, for the Greeks even, that has appetites. Like if you're hungry and you feel hungry, a lot of times we'll think of that as something in your body, but the Greeks would think of it as something in your soul. So there's obviously a connection between body and soul, because your body will sort of tell or connects with the soul in a way that's going to, make you feel hungry when you need food, when your body needs food or something like that. But the training, the thing that's most under your control is actually your psyche, not your body. So the way I like to explain it is, think about it like a race car driver, where your body is the race car, and the driver is your psyche. So, to get the race car to perform really well, you have to have both a really good, well designed and well, we would say trained, but a well-prepared car. But then what the driver does is the driver, makes the car perform things as best it can. So the relationship between the body and the soma and the psyche is really important. And in Greek thought, it's really, really close to the point where they feel like the intentional movement of the body, which can be sport, but sometimes it's easier to think about things like dance, or even if you've ever done martial arts and you do the forms, where you go through certain prescribed movements, that kind of intentional movement of the body would actually train your psyche, train your soul or your mind to work better. So in a lot of ways, you should think of, or the Greeks would think of, training of the body, or just athletics as, or gymnastics was the word they like to use, as actually training for the soul. Whereas we think in modern times, a lot of we go, I'm training my body, I'm going to the gym for my body. But for the Greeks, you don't have that. You have a distinction between body and mind, but movement of the body is something that always involves and conditions the soul. So they're thinking about it in terms of psyche, in terms of soul. Well, and the way you were describing it too, in terms of body and brain, is different than the way the Greek athlete would think about it. The Greek athlete would think about these repetitions as really repetitions of the, moving the driver, making the car do all these things to the point where the driver gets so used to it. And obviously the car breaks in a little bit, but the driver gets so used to it that she no longer has to consciously think about it. I mean, one of the things about mind, and the idea of psyche is now in modern times, a lot of times we confuse the calculating, conscious, think it through, planning part of our mind with the whole soul. Whereas things that you could say are unconscious, or some people will say things like instinctual, or you said, I think in improvised, or those things are also part of the mind. And there's actually really cool stuff in Eastern philosophy about this, about clearing out the mind, about concepts like no mind motion, about being able to try without trying, to think without thinking, by clearing the clutter out of your mind. Yeah. So a lot of it is that it isn't so much, just words like body and mind, is that the conception of mind that a lot of times we deal with, or we're taught to deal with, are too narrow to really kind of capture what a mind is. And one of the things that, like you say, I mean, I want to say, when you were talking about something maturing, I was thinking also sometimes it just clicks. It finally becomes, I mean, they'll say, I've heard terms like muscle memory. Well, muscles don't have memories, but there is a kind of, let's call it, the Greeks would say something like a harmony between mind and body that is achieved like a notes on a scale in music, and boo, you hit that right tone, and then it just flows perfectly, and it flows naturally. And that's of course, and those kind of phenomena are attested even in ancient times among athletes and in other kinds of performances too. Right. That is then recognized by the accolade. The accolades are supposed to recognize that achievement. Yeah. There's an interesting concept. You were talking about college, and I had recently written a paper for the Journal of Intercollegiate Studies, and I was talking about the value of collegiate sport. And one of the things I was talking about is the idea of forming a performance community. In other words, and this would be like a really elite level group in any sport, where you have all these people who are, as a community, moving their way up the ladder toward this, this kind of mind-body unison, or this idea, or even you might call that arete. They're committed to this level of excellence that requires them to make kind of an odd commitment and give up most of the normal things that, sort of normal people and other students care about. And I think that that's actually really important, because in any kind of an endeavor, whether it's business or art or, anything, the people who become really excellent, I think, have to in some ways depart from sort of the normal concerns and normal lifestyles that they see around them. And they do this, and by finding other people that are committed to excellence like you are, then through competition and also through cooperation, you push yourself higher and you form this community. And then sometimes you can kind of communicate, even if you don't have philosophical language, you can communicate about what that means to have, a really great move or a really great match, quite apart from the result. I mean, I think most athletes, well, many, if not most, will identify their best performances as something that didn't necessarily win. And there have been times they won and they didn't have that great of performance. At the time, maybe their best performance didn't result in a win, but you still value that. It's this sort of ultimate achievement of what you were going for.
Yeah.
And other athletes can understand that. That's what I mean by performance community. People that are focused on excellence and performance, on what the Greeks would call arete. They can recognize each other and they can support each other and push each other to keep getting better.
And so trying to
and
explain that is hard.
it's really unfortunate. I mean, one of the things is, I'm the first one to say, look, sports intrinsically speaking are meaningless. I mean, there's really nothing very meaningful in wrestling about being able to pin another person to the ground. If you take the whole question of the virtues that the arete that you need in order to do that, and then that arete could be used to do all kinds of effective things for people in all kinds of endeavors. And so instead of looking at arete and excellence as the sort of the wages, the earnings that we get from participating in sport, we look at it too much in terms of actual monetary reward or prizes, or maybe just attention, like you're talking about, how many viewers do you get, how many people watch the sport, how much adulation do they give the winners, and those kinds of things. And it's funny because those things, as far as I'm concerned, like in the economy of sport, I mean, the whole reason sport is entertaining to begin with is because it's fascinating to watch people who put their arete on display in these totally constructed synthetic activities that are just spectacular because you're seeing humanity do this. And I think the Olympic Games does just an amazing job at showing at becoming a showcase for arete and showing just all the different kinds of virtue that people can have, and all the different kinds of people who can have arete, and all the different ways they can have it. I remember in the last Olympic Games, there was some kind of a running race, and this guy got out there on the refugee team, who's obviously he was a refugee, he's had a hard life. He starts this race, and I think his hamstring snapped or something, and he fell to the ground and had to kind of crawl to the end. And I thought, man, there you go. This guy just cannot get a break. But the way he got up and the way he dealt with that showed such, beautiful grace and perseverance and all that. It was as good as, it's better than watching someone win.
Yeah.
And so that's the other thing, the aspect of sport where it's not just about winning, it's about being the kind of, I always say, being the kind of person that deserves to win, about having the kind of virtues that sometimes, not reliably, but tend to result in success in sports. And I think for people like us who care about sport and those things, it's also for trying to make sure sports preserve their ability to evoke those kinds of things by making sure that you can't win just with money or with cheating or with, by denigrating other people and stuff that's not virtuous. Yeah, the quote is actually from the one that you said about we can't call it education if it doesn't lead to arete. That's actually from Plato and one of the characters in his Laws. But I think it applies to society. I mean, and I make that argument, especially for college sports. I said in college, you shouldn't have sports programs there if they're not educational. And what's the education that they're building? And it has to do with this idea of building up, excellence that can then be applied to other kinds of endeavors that are more meaningful. I mean, there's nothing more meaningful than becoming the best person you can be. So it's not that sport is meaningless as a way to become the best person you can be. It's just meaningless by itself. Just kicking a ball into a net, or whatever the goal is that you achieve in sport, that's meaningless. What's meaningful is what it does to us, what it can do to us as human beings. It's a very humanistic idea that human beings, we fall so short of what we could be. We could be so much better than we are, and we have to struggle to be better than our most base instincts. And that's a struggle, and it's really a noble struggle, and sports helps it with us. But that's what gives sport its value, not how many viewers it brings in or all those kinds of things. How many? Oh, really? I mean, so they say. So
well, it's almost always
like, oh, well, it doesn't matter if you skip practice or you you aren't respectful, because the point of it is just, it's just to make you a better person. It doesn't matter if you're good at it or something like
Yeah.
that. Yeah,
And
because they're in the ancient religious context where sport emerges, they're thinking of sort of the gods as watching and choosing, who wins. And so, you want to be worthy, and you feel, the one who's worthy is, it will be chosen. And the other thing is, though, but that striving to be worthy is also worthwhile. They don't, I mean, one of the good things about Arte, it's actually better, than making winning your only criterion, because this way people can benefit. You can be sort of a champion of Arte, even if you don't necessarily win your particular sport. I mean, certainly success and failure in sport is should partly be conditioned by Arte. I mean, you should do better, but obviously we all have different potentials and stuff like that. But this allows people to educationally achieve all kinds of things in sport, regardless of whether their sport is popular and gets on TV and whether they win a college scholarship or anything. This, I think, is especially important for a lot of these things. If you think about it in the back of your head, is especially true for women, because women, given the car that their driver had, no matter how good your driver is, their car tends to be not quite as fast as the guys, so to speak, that physically you maybe don't have quite the same potential on average as others. And you never probably, like they talk about women's sports, and they should be equal. And there is a sense in which some women's sports become as popular as the men. Sometimes they're more, like in gymnastics. It seems like women's gymnastics is more popular than men's gymnastics for whatever reason. But usually it's the men's version that's more popular. But just like you were saying, popularity isn't necessarily an indicator of quality. Like, I'm sure in wrestling, you guys probably don't have a lot of respect for the whole phenomenon of world wrestling entertainment and those sorts of things, which it seems to me as an outsider kind of denigrates authentic wrestling by turning it into a show that pretends to be wrestling but isn't wrestling at all. The outcomes are determined. It's, they hit each other with chairs, stuff like that. And it's sort of like, this isn't wrestling. This is, is a thing.
it's theater.
It's not wrestling. But it's not, I mean, it's not obvious. And especially for kids. I mean, we started out kind of talking, in a positive way about how by experiencing sport, we have an idea about what matters. But unfortunately, there's no public discourse about it. So especially when you talk about kids, if all they ever hear is, how much money somebody can make or save or whatever, it's hard for them to have other kinds of values. I mean, it's like, how do you measure the value of something? And if the measurement always has to be in dollars, and it's, for me, it's, you're impoverished, because the funny thing about that is that if the thing that matters, the thing that has value is in fact money, then how come there's so many unhappy rich people, and in some of the richest countries of the world, or some of the unhappiest countries in the world? Obviously, there are other things that have value and can make a bigger contribution to happiness. And the thing about Arte that gives it value, I mean, one thing is it gives you some, perspective on what matters, but it's something that can be applied to other endeavors. And then if youth is a really great time to really focus on sport. And even Plato said, he had in his ideal city this 2-year period, kind of between the ages of around 18 and 20, or 20 to 22, where people could devote their lives completely to sport, to exercise, gymnastics, but the rest of the time they were supposed to be doing practical things, dealing with military training and other kinds of things. But the thing about Arte is you can apply it to other endeavors, and most of us eventually, I mean, at a certain point, at a certain age, you're no longer going to be the best that you could be at sport, but you can use all those things you learn in sport in some other kind of meaningful career or endeavor. And so the sad thing is, if you treat sport during your youth as the only thing that matters, and you don't use it to develop Arte, then when you're no longer capable of being really excellent in sport, you're also not capable of being excellent in anything else, because you don't even have the Arte to apply to these other kinds of activities, which you attributed no value, gave no value to. So you're right. It's dangerous, and it's troubling that we're so focused on that. I mean, even just, you can see it in administrative stuff, like, Olympic committees judge the success of their programs by the number of medals won. I mean, it's just, it's just a stupid way to do it, because if you read the Olympic Charter and what the whole purpose of the movement is, it has nothing to do with medals, and it's certainly not a competition between countries anyway. And even if it was a competition between countries, then it wouldn't be fair, because we don't have the same events, we don't have the same number of athletes. It's just